Good evening, Christopher.
Good
nice
evening.
to meet you
Nice
after a
to
long
meet you.
time.
Yes.
And welcome to Nairobi.
Thank you.
You followed the transitional justice process in quite a number of countries on the African continent.
Yes.
Could you tell us some of the important lessons you've learned from the different contexts?
Yes. That's a wonderful question. One of the more important lessons that are coming through are around victim-centeredness in transitional justice processes, where essentially we see the need to have a victim-centered approach whenever you design transitional justice processes and also when you execute them. And throughout the life of a transitional justice process, it's really important to have victims at the center. And that's one of the more critical lessons that are emerging. Obviously, a second lesson that is strongly emerging is the real for local ownership, where national actors are encouraged to really be at the center of designing the transitional justice mechanism. And this is really coming through, so where we encourage Africans to not only engage with this process, but we also engage with them so that they can walk with the processes all the way to the end. Of course, we also are seeing the need for these processes to be context specific. They need to respond to the context that exists, and therefore not to have a spaceship phenomenon where the mechanism comes from outside and comes in and then takes off on a copy and paste. No, we are encouraging a very context specific approach where we design it based on what the context is dictating.
Civil society actors play an important role in pushing for transitional justice outcomes. They have, however, been criticized for pursuing their own agenda or sometimes pushing for what they think the victims want rather than what the victims actually want. This issue is also often tied up with donor goals. What are your reflections on this?
There are obviously tensions that exist where we see donor-driven programs which civil society pick up on for purposes of being sustainable, and of course the needs of victims. And those tensions exist continuously, and we've seen them in many contexts. I think the most important thing is to ensure that donor programs can align to the real needs on the ground, and therefore civil society organizations that need to, of course, to be sustainable are able to again integrate and align. So really is to encourage all the actors to really sit down and look through what the context is dictating. And remember, I talked about context specificity, and then I also talked about victim-centeredness, and I talked about national ownership. And as a result, dialoguing and consultations around the kind of transitional justice programs to be deployed is vital and critical, and it does help in smoothing out those tensions that you can see and hear about civil society not really being in step with what victims' needs are.
Is it possible to talk about transitional justice in an active conflict context, or can we only talk about this when there is an actual transition underway?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and it faces us all the time. I think one of the things that you realize is that there are practicalities of pursuing programs of whatever kind, particularly transitional justice, when there's ongoing conflict. I mean, it's not practical in many cases, that where there's an active conflict going on and violations are continuing, and really that you want to apply certain types of transitional justice processes. So you then see there is usually a call for cessation of hostilities, permanent ceasefires, and all manner of calls for allowing humanitarian relief to enable those who have been affected by the conflict to receive humanitarian support. So it's quite difficult in those circumstances to ask for transitional justice. Nonetheless, whenever these conflicts are ongoing, we do see some approaches of transitional justice. For example, documentation of violations. You see that happening a lot. You also see the demands for accountability associated with documentation. And you can see that if there is a ceasefire in certain localities in the country, you can actually have a scenario where in these areas where there is safety, where there is cessation of hostilities, in parts of the country, you can see some maybe you can say broad strokes of conversations on transitional justice. In some cases, you do realize that conflicts occur at various levels, that sometimes you can have conflicts at national level and at subnational level. And those conflicts at national level maybe come to an end, but the subnational level conflicts continue. That's problematic. But you still can find that the national actors are able to design transitional justice interventions, and there are subnational conflicts which flare up here and there continuing. And so that's why you can be in a situation where transitional justice processes are ongoing, but there are pockets of conflicts in the country. But overall, in my experience, it's rare to find transitional justice processes going on when at national level we have conflicts. So that's very, very rare. It's very difficult. But at the end of the day, we do see, from my experience, conversations on transitional justice going on, even though there are pockets of subnational conflicts. Yeah.
What role does traditional justice play in transitional justice? We hear this being touted in several contexts, but it is rarely implemented or used to its full capacity. But why is it so?
My experience has shown that whenever you have indigenous, local, traditional justice processes, they do tend to, for a moment, solve a particular issue. So, for example, if there has been mass atrocities of some kind or deaths of some kind, and there is conversations between the local actors, and they then get into a traditional justice process and agree and are able even to repair each other, and you have horizontal types of reparations where they exchange whatever needs to be exchanged, whether monetary or other symbolic types of reparatory measures. The gap comes in when you don't have the national actor backing up those agreements, and also ensuring that the root causes of the conflict do not reemerge again. Some of them are socioeconomic, and some of them are political, some of them are security sector driven. So indigenous processes really require the backing of the national or central governments so that they can be sustainable. And that's usually the gap. But they can be effective. And they have been in place in many contexts. And in those contexts where they have succeeded, you do see the national government backstopping the process, and that really helps.
Could you give us one example, for example, where they have worked?
Yes. In Uganda, we have the Matu Oput process, which was practiced in Northern Uganda, and quite ably, you could see that the government of Uganda were really backstopping that process. In Rwanda, we've seen the Gacaca system. You see the Rwandan government really backstopping that system. In Sierra Leone, you have Fambul Tok. Fambul Tok was very important to allow people to talk by the fireside. And you can see the government really backstopping that system. And in South Sudan, there has been a number of local processes, the most famous being the Woundlit Conference in 1999. And in that period, you did see central actors really backing it up. Of course, it was really, you can say, the main players in Southern Sudan, the SPLM, backing up that. So you do count those examples of processes, indigenous, local, traditional processes, which can actually be deployed and are useful in helping resolve conflicts, in helping communities repair each other, in helping reconciliation. And I think that is one of the ways you can deploy a transitional justice measure to achieve your broad goals.
The South Sudanese transitional justice process has been one of the most difficult and protracted. What are some of the missteps that have been made in this context? Is there light at the end of the tunnel?
I think I can say that I see a glass as half full rather than half empty, so I'm a bit optimistic. I'm usually optimistic. But you talk about the missteps, and I think one of the challenges has been really the need to politically reconcile the political elites, allow for political trust to build between them, allowing them to politically reconcile themselves, because they have actually had a fallout. And so maybe rushing a process before the political elites who are driving the process to reconcile has been one of the stumbling blocks. And so you can see that at this moment, progressively, the political elites are getting comfortable with each other, are getting to build their trust with each other. And even though you sign a peace agreement and you say that you will implement a transitional justice process in 3 months, as is in the RACRIS, which is the revitalized agreement that is governing South Sudan, it has taken some time, 3 years, for the political elites to trust each other and really get to see that the way out to a positive outcome for South Sudan is for them to work together in a spirit of collaboration, in a spirit of collegiality. And I think that has been very important. So political trust is extremely important, and political will also backstopping the political trust.
What is, in your own view, on the use of amnesties in post-conflict societies or post-authoritarian regimes?
Yes. You know, we have a long history of amnesty, and it's not a black and white one. And on the continent, we've had experiences, the whole spectrum of what you'd consider amnesties, from what you consider de facto amnesties to one where you have blanket amnesties, to one where you have conditional amnesties. And really the international practice is not to give amnesty if there are cases of international crimes, as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. I think if it's clear that those types of crimes have happened, amnesties are discouraged. Amnesties are also discouraged in events where by giving it you may prevent investigation into types of crimes, and if they actually would be an impediment to the transitional justice process. But amnesties can be encouraged, particularly conditional amnesties, in exchange for certain goals of transitional justice, for example, truth-seeking. And we've seen that in parts of Africa, like in South Africa, conditional amnesties have been applied to encourage people to cooperate with a broader TJ mechanism, like the truth-seeking process, and that allows the full truth to come out, and it allows for the country to embark on its journey of healing and reconciliation much faster if there are no amnesties. So, as per the African Transitional Justice Policy, conditional amnesties are possible, but they should be very clear in terms of how they are governed. And also, we encourage that victims be consulted about those amnesties before they are given.
Thank you very much, Christopher.